Welcome to another Apollo Papyrus episode. I am Aaron Apollo Camp. For this episode, my interview guest has written novels, written short stories, and has been a contributing author to anthology books. Her novel is called Returning to You. Her short story collections are called Tomorrow and Beyond, Fae Deals Other Tales, and Fae Dreams Other Schemes. Anthologies she has contributed to include Written Pride, Today, Tomorrow, Always, Volume 1, and the books of the Anthologies of the Writing Journey series. And she is also the author of the Tichiford Tales middle grade book series. Her name is Gwen Tolios, and here's my interview with Gwen. Gwen Tolios, welcome to Apollo Papyrus.
Thank you.
Feel free to introduce yourself to our listeners.
So, hi everyone, I'm Gwen Tolios. I am primarily a short story writer, so I've been in a lot of anthologies and a lot of my own collections, and I tend to run the gauntlet. So I have some horror, I have some fantasy, and I have some science fiction stories, as well as one romance novel.
You've written 3 short story collections of your own, which are called Tomorrow and Beyond, Fae Deals Other Tales, and Fae Deals Other Schemes. Without spoiling too much of each short story collection, how many short stories are in each collection, and what types of stories can readers expect to find in each collection?
Yeah, so they do vary. Tomorrow and Beyond is primarily my science fiction collection. So there are roughly 17 stories in there, and it's a mix of cyberpunk. There are some contemporary stories, as well as a few superhero stories in there, because I consider superheroes a type of the science fiction genre. And then Fae Deals and Fae Dreams are both fantasy anthologies, primarily with twists on fairies, but also other creatures. Witches is a common theme that I have through there, as well as Selkies and Udines.
You've also contributed stories to a ton of anthologies, including multiple books in the Anthologies of the Writing Journey series, as well as the Written with Pride and Today, Tomorrow, Always Volume 1 anthology. What stories have you contributed to some of the anthologies in those books and those series?
Oh, a lot. I tend to be fairly at least in the short story terms, prolific. I don't do novels, but I tend to turn out several short stories a year. Written with Pride would be the most recent anthology that I've contributed to. And my story in that is actually about an astronaut who is in training in order to be the solo participant in a supply run to Mars. And so she has to go through an isolation training to pass that last checklist. It's between her and someone else to run the mission. And she doesn't handle the isolation pretty well. So that's the basis of that one. Today, Tomorrow, and Beyond was actually my first sale. So that story you can also find in Fae Deals. But that is about a girl who starts hallucinating her dead roommate, if you're interested in that. The Writing Journey anthologies, you are correct, Aaron. I've been in several of them. And the reason for that is actually the Writing Journey is my local writing community. And so every year they tend to put out an anthology, and it's their workshops and anthologies, if that makes sense. So they operate as a year-round workshop with the outcome being the anthology, but each one is themed. So depending on the story, or depending on the theme of the anthology, the story is a little different. The last one I participated in was called Denizens of the Deep. And I contributed a fantasy story about a paladin, who is investigating a water creature that is sinking ships in a harbor.
Okay, regarding some of the writing communities you're active in, you mentioned a couple of them. Do you encourage authors to find one or more writing communities to join and be an active part of, whether that be an in-person or online writing community?
I highly recommend a writing community. I will admit that I'm in many. I'm probably in a little too many. But it's good to have at least 2, I would say. Different people just have different positions and needs and support that they can offer you. So if you have two groups and you can kind of choose, okay, this might be my critique group and this might be the group that I go to for publishing advice, for example. And you also just having a group of writer friends who like to hang out online is sometimes nice if you want to do writing sprints. So you can say, hey, I'm just hanging around on the Discord. Who wants to write for 20 minutes and let's race? Who can write the most? And so having a writing community, I do think is very important. It's good encouragement. It's good ways to learn. It can keep your motivation up. That's one of the things that I think is really nice about NaNo, so National Novel Writing Month. That is a community I've been a part of for probably about 12 years at this point. But there's always great motivation and people cheering each other on, which really helps you meet your goals.
You've also written a two-book series. I believe it's a middle grade fiction series called Tichiford Tales.
Yes, I have.
Without spoiling too much of that series, what is each book in the series called and what is each book about?
Yeah, so the first one is called Sidel's Ghost Hunt, and the second one is called Sidel's Drama Camp Adventure. Um, there's planning to be a third, but it's still in progress, so I don't have a title for it yet. But the idea of it is that Sidel is a rising sixth grader, and she's having problems because she can see ghosts. Ghosts is a family trait, so that alone is not alarming to her, but it's getting in the way of her actually being able to socialize with her peers. So she's really lonely. She's trying to find some friends. In the first book, she actually decides, well, if a lot of the kids around here don't want to be her friend, she's going to try to make friends with a ghost. So she goes on a ghost hunt. Um, I will say it's a middle grade fantasy horror. So it's not a straight up adventure. There are some horror elements of it in it that might be a little scary for some kids. And then the second book, Sidel's Drama Camp Adventure, is a continuation of that plot line based off of the adventures she had in the first book. How does that affect her when she's going to a theater camp and ghosts show up there? I mentioned before that I'm a short story writer, so they are short books. I actually designed them for kids who are middle grade but don't really like to read. So if you don't like to read, you don't really want to read a big fat book, which a lot of books for middle graders are. So it's for older kids who want something quick and easy to read.
What do you enjoy most about writing short stories?
Probably because I can finish them. Novels are so long. But I will admit it's something that I have just found myself naturally falling into. As you start to write a story, it's not uncommon for writers to start to get this idea of how long does it need to be? How many plot beats does it have to have? How many arcs? How many characters? I tend to, when I write, really focus in on one theme, one arc, one character, and naturally that ends up just being a short story. And in short story, I mean both things that are flash fiction, so that's less than 1,000 words, or the second Sidel book is actually 12,000 words. So they're not long, heavy reads, but they're exactly the length that those stories needs. And it's not necessarily that I enjoy writing those more than novels. It's just the way that my writing style works better with shorter tales.
Now, you have written a novel and it's titled Returning to You. Without spoiling too much of your novel, what is it about?
So it is about a woman named Monica. So she has worked abroad for a travel agency for the past 5 years. But then her relationship with her dad has started to deteriorate. So she decides that she's going to come back home for the holidays, except her reunion with her dad does not go very well. And so she's forced to move in for the duration of her time in the States, which is about 3 months, with her old college roommate, a woman by the name of Lisa. And then Monica unfortunately realizes that the college crush she had on Lisa didn't go away. So returning to you is a little bit of a family drama, but also a romance.
Now,
I will.
aside from books that you've contributed to, are all the books written entirely by you, self-published, traditionally published, or hybrid published, or did you use a mix of publishing methods for your books?
I actually used a mix of publishing methods. So I consider myself a hybrid author. So I have worked with both small presses and I have done the self-pub route. Returning to You came out with a small press called Nine Star Press. And the anthology that we talked about before, Written with Pride, came out with Not a Pipe Publishing. I've also way back when had worked with a few podcasts, so where they had recorded my stories for me. So then I'm working with those publishers as well. And then a lot of my short story collections and the Siddell series, I have self-published myself, based off of things that I have learned from my writing communities. And also because I have found that short stories are hard to have either a small press or a traditional press pick up. They are so tiny. The returns are so small. Those type of things I have felt are better to push out yourself.
Now I'm going to talk about you coming out as asexual. How did you come to realize that you're asexual, and how difficult was it for you to come out publicly as asexual?
I'm gonna back up a bit, if that's all right, Aaron, and explain what asexuality is. I'm sure there's some people who aren't familiar with the term. So asexuality is the A part of the LGBTQIA alphabet soup. I will admit it's kind of long and wordy. And it's for people who actually don't experience sexual desire. So there's something called the split attraction model, meaning being romantically attracted to someone is different than being sexually attracted to someone. And sometimes it's very hard for people to untangle those feelings. I will admit that that was probably why it took me a while to figure out that I was ace, which a lot of people kind of start to figure that out. They're out there, they're dating, and they're realizing that their experiences are not matching up with the experiences of their friends. And so that's kind of what happened with me too. Um, and in that case, it wasn't necessarily hard for me to identify myself. It was more like a slow realization of, oh, here is me, and here are other people who are like me. That's really cool. And so from there, it wasn't very hard for me to publicly come out as ace. I do talk about it from time to time, especially on my TikTok. And Returning to You is a romance novel with an ace character. So Monica, the lead, identifies as asexual.
How do you feel about LGBTQIA plus representation in the book industry?
It depends. And I say that because that's such a broad range of things, right? How gay representation is compared to lesbian representation, compared to trans representation is going to vary. Ace representation specifically, I think, is still slowly being developed. A lot of it is you can find in the indie space. That's one of the reasons that I went with a small press publisher. There's just more of a readership there. Ace representation only really started popping up in traditional media in the late 2010s. So still pretty new in terms of book publishing, and it tends to really only live in YA. That's something that I have noticed over the years is diverse representation is more likely to show up in YA and then maybe trickling down to middle school. Whereas a lot of the harder genres that I read, so like adult fantasy, adult science fiction might have a smattering of there, but it doesn't become a central core of the characters. And I'm sure that there are exceptions and things change as time goes on. And I think that we are getting better, especially because as we talk about different types of rep. You have rep where it's really just a character who has identified as one type of sexuality versus having that be a core component of the character and then having that actually be part of a main character and then being a huge part of their plot arc as the story progresses. And I feel like we're approaching, especially in YA, that latter part where there are a few stories, again, specifically within Ace Rep that I can think of, where that representation is a core component of the character and this part of the character's drive within the plot. I think gay and lesbian representation got there a little earlier. It's a larger representation, if that makes sense. People have been aware of it just for a longer period of time. I feel like bi representation has slacked a little bit. It wasn't as easily accepted, I think, as the others, but is again kind of coming into their own, and you can start to see a lot more rep now, which is very heartening.
One final question I'm going to ask you, and I've never asked any guest on this podcast this question before, but how is your cat today?
Grumpy. Um, so she likes to avoid me. So the fact that she is within the same room as me is a win. And she's just kind of curled up on the couch right now, but not looking at me because it's either an outright glare or I'm being ignored. Um, but that's part and parcel for her.
Gwen, you were an amazing guest. I thank you for appearing on Apollo Papyrus.
Thank you for having me.
I hope to read some of Gwen's stories soon. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding y'all to write and read your passion. Bye for now. Remember to subscribe to the Apollo Papyrus YouTube channel at www.youtube.com/@Apollo Papyrus and the Apollo Papyrus Substack newsletter at apollopapyrus.substack.com. Y'all can visit the Apollo Papyrus website at campaaronapollo.wixsite.com/Apollo Papyrus and follow Apollo Papyrus on Threads, Instagram, Facebook, and Tumblr at Apollo Papyrus. Copyright 2024, Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of our audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited, except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.